Welcome back. Well, yes, we've got those two gentlemen, as you've seen, joining us to weigh in on the conversation about brain drain in the country and more. So let's just go ahead. We've got Dr. Austin Sam George. He's a media and communication consultant, former commissioner for information in Rivers State, as well as Honorable Dayo Bush Alibioshu, who is the pioneer chair, actually, of the subcommittee on the AFCC. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Good morning.
Let me start with you, Dr. Sam George. You know, incidentally, both of you were professionals before you got into the side of the people, before you got into governments, both at the state and the legislature, because those are arms of government. But now you're back on the other side. So from that perspective, and then you've been professionals, you at least get clear understanding about some of these issues about professionals being underemployed and challenges such as that. But with respect to this conversation about brain drain, it's been a persistent one, but even in the health sector, for instance, where we seem to have fallen below the universally recommended doctor-patient ratio. I think they say we have one doctor to 5,000 people here, as opposed to what they recommend, one doctor to 600, which I think in the UK they have, where some of these doctors are going. How do we even begin to address this?
Well, we address it, Chamberlain, by having, a healthy appreciation for professionalism. I mean, you can't spend as much as parents spend, training medical doctors, and you pay them peanuts. And even when the salaries, and even the salaries themselves in most cases, are either underpaid or not paid at all. Look, there is an economic concept called mobility of labor. What this means is that if your expertise is not appreciated somewhere, you simply move it to somewhere else where it will be appreciated. So that's exactly what is happening. So the very concept of mobility of labor says that if you can't pay me, if you can't appreciate the level of professionalism and expertise that I bring to the table, I will move to somewhere else. And that's what is happening. You see doctors now moving from Nigeria to Saudi Arabia, to the UK, to the US. And these doctors, when they get to these new places, actually function very professionally. I remember during my days at the university in South Africa, in 2 successive sessions, the head of the medical facility of my university in South Africa were actually medical doctors from Nigeria. So if you don't pay, if you underestimate the expertise of professionals, they are going to simply move to somewhere else where they'll be appreciated. And, it becomes a massive loss, for the country. And again, for the host country. If the World Health Organization says we should have a doctor-patient ratio of 1 doctor to 600 patients, and we now have a very serious deficit where we have 1 doctor to 5,000 patients, and then we have this kind of months-long strike action. It shows that we have a very serious emergency situation in the health sector. And I think that we ought to have this kind of corresponding understanding that except you pay and appreciate professionalism, we are going to have this kind of sectoral crisis.
Honorable Bush, does it come across to you as though, we understand the importance of what's going on, but perhaps the bottlenecks here and there trying to sort some of these out? Because, members in the assembly usually talk about how do we address this. Government says, just a couple of things here and there to sort out. What do you think?
I think we need to back up a bit and look at things. Excuse me. First of all, Doctor had already said we do not appreciate professionalism in general, period. Whether engineering, medicine, across board. Now, it's very scary listening to the ratio, but it didn't just start today, where a recommendation of 1 doctor to 600 people is what's required, but that isn't the case. However, it's important to know that people will always travel in the pursuit of greener pasture. Wherever you go, you'll see different, even when you go to the United Kingdom, you'll see doctors from Sri Lanka, Pakistan, India, all over the world, Iran, and so on. However, I choose to look at things from a different point of view, where the focus has been mainly on medical doctors. We're not talking about veterinary medicine. We're not talking about veterinary doctors. especially when you get to understand that the last several issues have been from animal to man. I was reading a report that said that since the birth of Nigeria, we've only produced about 5,000 veterinary doctors. And we have just about, out of the 5,000, some are dead, some have moved abroad. But presently, we only have about 500 in active practice in Nigeria. Now we think, oh, it shouldn't bother us, it's about animals. It should bother us. We consume meat, for example. I would take Lagos State alone. 6,000 cattle heads are slaughtered in Lagos State for consumption. There's an issue with tuberculosis. It can be passed from animal to man. Now, when you take a look at the ratio of 500 across, I'm not even talking about the number of, I'm not talking about the population, I'm talking about the number of states that we have, 36 states and 1 FCT. And you divide that by 500, it gives you an average of 13.5 veterinary doctors. Which means if you look at that, I mean, in each state, if you take that average and you apply it in Lagos, I'm just talking about cattle now, 6,000 cattle heads consumed every day. Now, you have the lungs. People consume the lungs of, which is what they call fuku. They consume a lot of that because it's the cheapest or one of the cheapest parts of the cattle. A big chunk will probably be sold to you for 50 or 100 naira. Now, for you to kill the bacteria in that, in the lungs, it means you have to have cooked it over a period of time. But if you do that over 30, 40 minutes, it means it completely breaks down. So you're actually consuming, when it's used for suya, suya is cooked for just about 12 minutes for it to be consumed. There's no way the bacteria would have been killed. Now, why do you think tuberculosis is amongst the top diseases we have in Nigeria right now? How do we address that? We now relate that to the number of doctors that we have. How do you treat that? Are you saying 13 doctors can actually go through and examine very well 6,000 cattle heads? I reiterate, I'm just talking about Lagos State alone. I'm not talking about the other states now. So when you look at it, I think we need to move back and really take a critical look at what really is the issue beyond. Because you find out that by the time you say, oh, they're going to earn ₦1 million and a month and we're dealing with other issues, by the time you get to a certain point, even the million wouldn't be enough again.
Let me bring this to Dr. Tam George. I mean, the Ivory Tower, being a communication person yourself, the issues he's raised, what is the missing link in terms of us as a country mainstreaming such conversation, given the times that we're in now? Because lots of people usually look to the Ivory Tower for leadership. Societies look to them to chart the course. But over here, I stand corrected, it does appear as though they don't seem to be the leading light. What's the missing link?
Well, in the university is like a factory, where manpower is developed and then, sent across society. You find that wherever there are sectoral needs, for instance, we need more doctors, whether they are veterinary doctors or doctors that treat human beings, or whether we are dealing with engineers, all kinds of professionals are, trained across the manpower development spectrum. The university being the tertiary level. You see, but when these, people go into society, they've got to find jobs. Either they create jobs for themselves or they've got to find jobs either in the private sector or in the public sector. Now, if they find these jobs in the public sector, they've got to be properly remunerated. Once they are not remunerated the way they should be paid, there's going to be a crisis. What we should do, I think, is we need to declare a state of emergency in critical sectors. In South Africa, from my experience, if there are particular shortages, manpower deficits in particular sectors, they classify them as, what they call, manpower deficit sectors, to say, look, we need accountants, and then there is a bespoke very tailored manpower development programs that says we need to provide this number of doctors across not so number of years. But that means sometimes they go through mentorship, they go through employment schemes, that absorb them even before they get to their final year. But we don't have those we used to have those kind of systems here in Nigeria in the 70s and the early 80s, where, we have job programs, in the universities where, employers go there to say, look, we need particular kinds of manpower and we want to absorb them, give them orientation from this point in the university until they do a transition into the world of work. But we no longer have those kind of things these days. We have one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, over 33% of our people are unemployed, and that does not include those who have already given up hope of getting jobs. We are talking about people who are actively seeking employment but can't find jobs. Out of this, we have over 60% of young people not being able to get jobs. So if you have skill and you don't get jobs, or you have skills and you get a job and you are not properly paid, then you have a manpower crisis.
Just to add this bit of information before Khalid comes in, there's this, I think it was yesterday, that the president launched this Jubilee Fellowship program for UCOM members who've just left, so it's supposed to absorb them for a year. It's supposed to be a year, so who knows if that's a thing. And I think so far, the one for yesterday, 20,000 of them will be in that scheme for a year, and then afterwards, who knows if it will address this kind of concerns.
Yes, that's a very good initiative. In fact, we should be having more of that, not just at the federal level. Sometimes we tend to give disproportionate attention to what happens at the federal level. We have states as well. A lot of our people are disaggregated in states, 36 states plus Abuja. We need to see a great deal of emphasis on employment creation across the 36 states. So if the federal government is doing this, we need to have that kind of, attention placed on job creation at the state levels as well.
Well, let me take this to Honorable, because Dr. Tam George, you spoke about, an emergency situation, and you said that we should declare state of emergency. It's funny, we've heard that in security, now we're hearing that in other sectors. But Honorable, you've been in government, at least at the legislative level. I know there's always that conversation about whether or not it's government, but it is government, at least that's what we learned in school, and that should be the right thing. The question is, what kind of premium is placed on issues such as this? We don't hear legislators, for example, government appointees protest and say, well, our earned allowances have not been paid. When they need things, these things are provided, at least the much we know. But when it comes to the health sector, we've had 4 strikes in 2 years. Resident doctors, 16,000 of them have down-tooled for 4 times in just 2 years. And it sort of begs the question, what's the thinking really, honestly?
To be honest with you, it's been over a 2-year period. It's been an ongoing issue as far back as maybe 20 years ago. Probably the issues are getting more than they used to be. One of the things we need to understand is we have to look at policies. If you look at the media, they've had quite a number of they've had a decent amount of representation at the National Assembly with people like Uche Ubani and a few other members there. The question is, there's a saying that if you want to change a situation, you don't fight it. You create an alternative, or you create the way you look at it and then address it from there. If the medical profession, whether the NMA, the body as a whole, can look at how to drive policies rather than have it, handed over to them, it would also be a way through which things can be changed. How do I mean? If you're able to sponsor, if you're able to support certain medical doctors, who would have a clear-cut understanding that, listen, the reason you're going there is to change this, is to push this policy, then things get done. You can't, how do you legislate on what you do not have a thorough understanding of? It's always very important to have somebody, an insider, an inside man. It's either you do that, or you decide to look for a sponsor. Look at the tobacco industry. How do they get away with a lot of things they get away with? is because they have people who represent them, their interests there. I think it's high time that approach be adopted, and then we'll see how things go from there.
I mean, quite interesting, really. But, you know, when bills are drafted, you have inputs, as they say, from stakeholders. You have these experts come on board. They look at, you know, the spirit, the letter of the law, and try to ensure that it reflects the yearnings of that particular sector. I mean, of recent, the controversy around, you know, the press bill and the rest, whether or not, you know, there were wide consultations, as it were, because that's how it is meant to be. So, yes, it is good to have these people maybe in the House of Reps or in the Senate, but there'll be questions around whether you have enough number to even get enough votes to allow those things pass. I don't even want to go into the recent controversies around voting, whether or not things were done the right way. But doesn't that also speak to the representatives' touch with reality? Because whether or not you have as much doctors on the floor of the House, this is the reality. The hospitals in their constituencies, for example, don't have enough medical doctors, don't have enough equipment. So these are things they know and they ought to legislate on.
There would always be legislation at a certain level. But will it... I'll give you an example. I spoke with somebody and I asked... I painted a scenario. A few legislators, we sat together and I said, listen, if you see two people fighting, how do you handle the situation? What kind of laws would you prefer? And they said, well, disturbing the peace and this and that. And so I had to take them down to say, listen, lawmaking requires skills, a lot of skills and understanding. Have you gotten to understand that there are two operating systems, the cortex and the amygdala? How does each work? And if you haven't trained people to understand the switch between these two, are you sure you're not just going to be jailing people for the sake of jailing them? It's enough. You can come up with laws on the floor of the House to support the remunerations, but is that all what it's about? These guys, they're not just talking about what their earnings are. They're talking about their conditions. They're talking about the professionalism involved in here. They're talking about a whole lot of things. And by the time you get to the public hearings, the one you referred to had a lot of attention because it had been ongoing and a lot of people were interested. As we speak, those who are interested in the welfare of the doctors are the doctors themselves. But it's a different case when the situation or the issue affects beyond spreading outside of the box rather than just inside of the box. So it's not just having those medical doctors there, but having the required amount of support to push through what you actually want.
Speaking about spreading outside the box, at the moment we're talking about curbing this brain drain. But then we've heard executives of corporations, but even at the state level, talk about the challenge of human capital. So it seems as though there are two extremes. Brain drain, the professionals leaving the shores for value where they'll be appreciated. And then you also have available, they talk about the quality of manpower that's available to them needs to be, we need to shore it up. But from what you saw while you had your stint at the government level, give us your perspective of what we're dealing with here in terms of both extremes.
No, I think we are dealing with a manpower crisis. If you have people who have expertise and there is no deliberate public policy to integrate them into the world of work and remunerate them, and they leave or some of them are not employed, you already have a crisis. We are talking about medical doctors now. There are so many thousands of medical doctors who are in fact not employed. They are not employed in the state service, they're not employed in the federal service, and we have thousands more who are leaving, who are employed, but have industrial grievances and are leaving the country. So I think what we need to do is to have a very specific and targeted policy response to say that, look, we have critical need in specific sectors. One, how do we generate the manpower, building synergies with universities, polytechnics, and colleges of education, depending on the area of manpower development we are looking at. And then once they leave the systems, once they leave the tertiary institutions, we need to have a system that absorbs them. And then I don't think that the question of salaries should be such a contentious issue. I would have thought that once you recognize that a certain level of manpower development is needed, you come up with specific structures of salary, salaries for the staff. But that flows from an appreciation of the manpower need. My sense, frankly, is that there is a tendency for people in government to believe that, look, if you don't have a job, you better create one for yourself. If you do have a job in the government service and you are not properly paid, you can leave. I mean, we've heard the Minister for Labor say that, oh, well, I mean, if doctors feel that they want to leave the country, they can leave because we have a lot. Now we recognize, because of this crisis, that in fact we have a far lower ratio, a higher ratio of doctor-patient connection. You have 5,000 patients being attended to by just one doctor over time. That's a very serious deficit. That's only for the medical section. What about engineers? We have engineers, who are coming from the universities. I would have thought that if we had direct public manpower policy, you could say, okay, those who are still in the university could take up internships at the ministries of works, even to get practical experience. At the time they leave the university, the state governments, across the country could say, okay, come and work in different sectors, in different sections of the department or the Ministry of Works, Housing, Transport, and the rest of them. So unless we have this kind of deliberate public policy where we work with those who are training manpower and then eventually work out a scheme that absorbs them and then work out a salary structure that is competitive, because these are professionals, as I keep saying. So unless we have that kind of synergy, we are going to have this kind of problem. I think that we should do a manpower study by saying that, look, what are the critical areas of manpower needs in this country? How can we prioritize this? I think Jonathan did something, the Jonathan administration did something similar when it said, look, if you made a first class across the board, especially in the sciences, we'll train you wherever you want to go. And they came up with dedicated, funds for those kind of achievers. Over time, not immediately, but over time, over 10, 20, 15 years, you'll see that the country has specific quality of manpower across specific sectors. And that's how you grow. Look at Taiwan, a country of just 23 million people. They have the 6th largest foreign reserves in the world, and they have one of the most technically proficient manpower in the world. They are just 23 million people. Why is that? Because they just prioritize manpower development. They don't have oil, they don't have gas. In fact, to build a house in Taiwan, you have to import gravel and sand from China. That's how tough their topography is. So they just put the emphasis on manpower development, and they have one of the most technically proficient, manpower base on earth. They are just 23 million people. So I think that these things are just a function of public policy and whether we are ready, to develop human capital.
And, we've also spoken previously about how, I think this kind of even called Denmark, how they prioritize those who they recruit into the teaching level, because if you're not up there, they just do a lot of things. And so, gentlemen, it's September 1st. So what? What's the significance? We'll talk about that when we return in just a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back. Well, today the Southern governors earlier had said that they were going to sign the anti-open grazing law in their respective states. As you may have seen when we had the opening sequence, some states have alluded to that. They've signed some of those bills. Of course, there will always be reactions, disagreements, agreements. It's a democracy. Nothing wrong with that. Honorable Bush, let me ask you. You've heard about, also seen the way the conversation has gone about security, how we're handling it, who is saying what. And so from what you've seen, are we taking the right measures? Perhaps in addition to that, what should we actually be doing to ensure that we focus on the right things to move the country forward?
When we talk about security, I have always, the security situation from state to state differs, from region to region differs. We also need to appreciate the fact that every administration, since the inception of this democracy, has had a defining crisis as regards security issues. Yes, it's been taken to another level right now, but we need to understand. I wonder and ponder sometimes to say, okay, how do we go about this? And you realize that the local government councils really have a role to play in this as well, a serious role to play. Insecurity does not happen in Abuja and sent to Lagos, does not happen in Abuja and sent to Rivers, doesn't happen in the center and sent to other states. It happens in wards at community levels. Each area has the area commander. Each ward has a divisional police officer. It's important to look at what is being done at those various community levels, at those wards. What has really been happening there? What is the quality of even the representation on the parts of the councillors? How do they see things? What is their understanding of what happens there? If we take that out of the equation, we will continue to look up to the Inspector General in the center to come help handle things that happen in the communities. So how do we break it down? How do we break it down into parts and begin to reassemble, by taking a critical look at things? I think that's something that really needs to be looked at, and it will go a long way. I understand that, yes, you have the state security presence in those areas, but how are they able to function if there isn't the required synergy with those communities? That's the question we should ask ourselves.
Yeah, well, Dr. Tam George, so what did he glean when he speaks about the functions, the operations in states? Because, these chief executives, they should know better. But here they are with this position that this is what they think is the way out. So in terms of the functions of those security, policing structure in those states, what did you see as perhaps the missing link or the gap that could be corrected?
Well, we are dealing with a paradox, Chamberlain. We are dealing with a situation where the state governors are supposed to be the so-called chief security officers of their states, and yet they do not have any direct command and control mechanism when it comes to dealing with the police force. The police, as we know, is constitutionally centralized. There is the Inspector General of Police, who is appointed by the President, and then there are all kinds of structures, below him. They are all ultimately answerable to the Commander-in-Chief and not to the governors. But then the paradox is that the governors, even if they do not have direct control over the policing structures in the state, also have yearly budgets running into billions of naira as security votes. And so when the governors say, for instance, that they are helpless, and that they don't have control over the security forces, and therefore they are helpless in security crisis situations, the question then arises as to what then do they do with the billions potentially, running into, sometimes if they stay in office for up to 8 years, it really amounts to quite a lot, that they have as security vote. So I think that we need to be very honest concerning our response to the security structure in this country. Do we want to continue with the over-centralization of the policing structure, or do we want to decentralize and have state police? The people, I sense, are ready for state police. After all, I mean, we all come from different communities, and in my own community, for instance, there's an informal policing structure. Not because they wear uniforms, but if somebody goes, too far from legal behavior, they apprehend and then invite the police to deal with those individuals. So there is some kind of community policing happening at one community level or the other. But if we want to formalize the structures and say we want state police so that state governors can more appropriately deal with security situations, are the politicians themselves ready? I think that while the people are ready, the politicians are not ready for state police.
Speaking about the security votes, I had an informal conversation with one of the executives of the states, the chief executive of the states, and he said, look, trust me. Bottom line was, he said, trust me, you guys don't want to know. The country is not ready to know what we actually do with security votes. In other words, I think he's saying that we may be disappointed if we actually find out the kinds of people or institutions that benefit from such funds. That's the impression I gleaned from it. But about the state police, because I mean, almost at all levels, they always argue that, well, remember what we had before? We had this regional police, state police. We saw what happened. Some politicians did certain things and that. Well, why should we have state police? You mean federal government cannot do certain things? How do we go about that conversation? Because it's something you say needs to be done, because informally it does exist in different states.
I think that the citizens are ready for state police, but the politicians themselves, I'm telling you, because I've been in government, they are not ready for state police. If they will use it in a way, I mean, we are dealing with one problem now, but we'll be dealing with 36 major crises, once, we allow state police. I think that what we should do is to introduce a great deal of accountability and transparency first in the policing structure and in the way public finances are used. I mean, I would like to know, for instance, what governors do with billions of naira budgeted every year for security votes. We need to have that conversation to see whether there is accountability and transparency. But I think that for me personally, I would rather want to see the security votes. Sometimes states have as much as 20 billion naira, 30 billion naira annually for security votes. I think that money should be deployed towards job creation. Sometimes we forget the connection between lawlessness, criminality, and joblessness. I think that we should have an understanding that, look, the more and more good paying jobs that we create, the more employment schemes that we create, the lesser and lesser we will deal with criminality. So this kind of connection is the missing link. There is a tendency to always look at only the hardware issues. How do we buy baton? How do we buy guns? How do we buy bayonets? To fight criminality. But I think that if given a chance, more and more people would rather lead a legal and profitable, useful life rather than resort to criminality. And the way to go, therefore, is to dedicate these so-called, security votes to create targeted jobs. I want to see those jobs in verifiable numbers across the states every year, so that we will minimize the tendency for criminality.
Okay, I'll go to Honorable soon, but as Chamberlain said earlier, you were on the side of the people, then you went to government, back on the side of the people, and perhaps it's only fair to ask you about security votes, because you're as curious as a lot of other Nigerians. While in government, did you find out anything about it?
Well, I can't account for how security votes. I was never governor. I was commissioner for information. I didn't have information about how these security votes were spent. And it's not just in Rivers State. I mean, across the country, we need to know. I mean, if governors are budgeting and actually collecting, billions of naira every year, annually, every year. And some of these governors remain in office for 8 years without a single shred of paper to show, in terms of transparency and accountability, what they actually used, these resources for. I think that when you use public funds, appropriate, public funds to this extent, to the extent of billions every year in the name of fighting insecurity, you can't legitimately claim to be helpless and simply say, oh, well, I don't control the police. If you don't control the police, what do you do with the security votes running into billions? These are public funds.
Interesting.
I think that the way to go is to introduce more accountability and transparency in the way some of these resources are used.
So, with the benefit of hindsight, I mean, I just need to resolve this.
Yes.
If you were still in government, would you say, well, we need to know?
Oh yes, I definitely would suggest that. Look,
so that's something you wish you had done then.
Well, when you are a member of the Executive Council, you can only make a suggestion, but the implementation, the acceptance of, and framing it into public policy is the responsibility of the Chief Executive of the state.
Okay, Honorable, I'm glad we're breaking this down. I mean, you essentially started from saying we should start at the grassroots, basically. I mean, break this down. Don't let it sound as though all the attacks happen on the national scale. They happen at the wards, at local governments. And he pushed it up to the state governors saying, how about the security votes? And, regarding this conversation, you might want to respond to that as well. But are state governors really ready to be the chief security officers? I mean, we've heard state governors speak united on issues, things about bailout funds and the rest. They have one voice. And if they really wanted to make a change, as well, I imagine it's that easy. Call your legislators across the state and say, this is what we need you to push when it's time to push it. And I imagine it will be quite easy. So, adding to what Doctor has spoken about earlier, do you think we're really ready to have that conversation? Are we really helpless?
There's a saying that in the court of law, both parties know the truth. It's the judge that's on trial. Why would any executive want to take control? You don't have to take control. You can have a good working relationship. It's all about working together, like the components of a vehicle. The steering isn't related to the gear. The gear isn't related to the clutch, but they have been put together to achieve a common goal of moving from one location to another. I have listened to this and I have heard it over and over and over again. But we're in a society where sometimes to hang the snail, it can be accused of overspeeding. We need to move away and focus on what are the issues at hand. With total respect to Doctor, sometimes when you want the truth, the question is, can you handle the truth? When you ask, in this, I wouldn't mention the countries, but we're aware of countries that actually pay people to stay away and not commit crimes. Countries that focus on tourism. How do they explain such spendings on the budget? What do they call it? Under what header? So it will be very, very, very almost impossible for those governors to explain. I haven't been a governor, so it's not like I'm siding them or I'm being on the part of the. I'm neither on the part of the people nor am I on the part of the government. I am being a Nigerian first before sides are taken. How do you explain those things? And it's usually hard to see governors not get along with their commissioners of police. It's usually hard. And when there isn't a good working relationship, most of them make a request to have the commissioners redeployed. However, when you take a step backwards and you look, you discover that there are a lot of issues. Even when you look at, I'm not blaming the police, but sometimes it's important to take a closer look at how certain things are done. Hardly do you see a commissioner of police work in a particular area for more than 2 years. Boom, he's moved to another place because somebody else, they need to, it's as if there's a policy that requires them to be moved around ever so often. So by the time you see one now, he will tell you, oh, I'm DPO in this area. In another year, he will tell you he's been moved elsewhere. And then it's a cycle that starts all over again. You also see that there are a lot of states that have, what I think Lagos State started it under Governor Fashola. when Fashola was governor here, a security trust fund. Most states have come up with this to combat, to fight these things. And I'm aware that a lot of states, the security trust funds have a fund has the cooperation of private practices, banks, and the corporates side of society. But there's a cultural issue there. There's a basic cultural issue that, if not sorted, if not taken care of, it's not about the Buhari administration or the Goodluck administration, or every administration has had a defining security crisis in this country.
Well, if you could give your response in as short as possible with this one, in consideration of Dr. Tam George's perspective about state police, there are many who are of the impression that the National Assembly actually are, quote-unquote, a clog, because they think that, especially underscored by what they saw the last time, that the vote on whether or not state police should pass stops or is impeded by the National Assembly. Do you share the same view?
Well, to be honest with you, they were elected as people with the ability to make rational decisions, as adults, with stable mental capacity. Now, to get them to do what you want means you have to convince them. I've said on the program here before that there's this intentional divide created, us against them. And when that happens, you see that there are sides. You now have to play some level of politicking to say, you know what, guys, and like I said, there's the governors forum anyways, and these governors have these, all the governors that make up the governors forum have this, to a certain extent, some level of influence over their representatives. So if it's something that's really, truly required, why can't they all come to a round table? I mean,
some argue that they thought that it came across to them as though party loyalty seemed to overshadow that influence that governors will have.
And that's why I said earlier on that it's cultural. Your ability to see things. What is culture? Culture is just the collective programming of the mind. How you see things, the lenses through which you look at life. If you're able to change the way you look at things, the things you look at will begin to change. So when that is the case, the most important thing is most of the representatives have town hall meetings. I know the Lagos State Assembly just had one on drugs, or the use and influence of drugs. Members of the House of Representatives also do this. So it's important to engage them at that community level rather than stay away. Even when these town hall meetings are called, what you find out is 80% of those present are also politicians.
Oh dear. Well, Mark has got some questions for you. Mark, go ahead.
Indeed, mine is for Dr. Tam George when he's talking about the state, it was in the state on one side and the people on the other. Some people will say that aren't they supposed to be working towards a common goal? But I think that the big question right now is this. I mean, with regards to the crisis which has necessitated this bill, this deadline, it was seen that the southern governors gave, the farmer herders crisis. Now, there are questions as to whether this was the right way to go, because what we have seen is that a number of states, for instance, the Southwest decided to react by setting up Amotekun. We saw an attempt in the Southeast to come up with something. Even the South, there was some movement in that direction. But eventually what we saw across board for southern governors was this response to ban open grazing and to say, some states say they're going to enforce it. Now, I don't know how this has been perceived in other parts of the country, but it does look like there's going to be, or that there is some I don't want to use the word misunderstanding, but it looks like it has not been very well received in some quarters. There is some resistance to this. How do you think that this will work, the enforcement of the bill, of the law rather, for those states that have passed it, with regards to those at whom it is targeted? Do you think that this is going to further foster unity across the country, or do you think that this has the potential to degenerate?
Well, I think that, the state governors have direct administrative oversight over their states, and that comes with legislating social behavior in their respective states, so long as it doesn't clash with the provisions of the Constitution. Open grazing is something that obviously has created a very major public debate. And I think to some extent it's unfortunate that we've spent nearly the better part of 7 years in this country simply debating the movement of cows. I don't think there's any country in the world that wastes so much time talking about cows the way we have done. But the question of open grazing is now obviously a legislative matter for so many states. I recall that when I was in government, we didn't have open grazing legislation in Rivers State, but we apparently have now. The governor, I think a few weeks ago, have signed legislation forbidding open grazing. I think that the state governors should rise to the challenge of regulating animal husbandry in their respective states according to the peculiarities of their states. If you pass a legislation in Rivers State, I don't think that your intention will be to please someone living in Zamfara or someone living in Plateau. You simply want to look at the specificities of your own realities in your state and then respond legislatively. I think that the question of the federal government wanting open grazing in 25 states, I'm supporting it with public funds, has generated a very unfortunate public debate. Let the state governors decide what is good for their people. It's consistent with federalism, and if they think that open grazing is something that is not allowed, especially in agrarian states where open grazing would mean that cattle will be moving from farm to farm, consuming farmers' produce. This is a very serious flashpoint in many states, and I think that if it calls for legislative action on a state-by-state basis, the state governors have a responsibility to rise to the challenge. That's one part. The second part is that we now see a very unfortunate intersection between open grazing and criminality. We've seen so many accounts by people who have been abducted, whether in Edo State, in Plateau, in other places in the country, where they say that, look, we suspect that even those who abducted us, those who are involved in open grazing, do not even seem to be Nigerians. They seem to be speaking language that is not indigenous to Nigeria. The system appears to have been infiltrated by all these kind of people who can, I think, only be controlled by strict legislation concerning open grazing. So in states where open grazing are allowed, I think they should allow it. But in states where they think that open grazing is a flashpoint, for crisis, I think they need to respond legislatively, and I suspect that that's what the southern governors are doing.
All right, gentlemen, we need to wind down. But just very briefly, Honorable Bush, there was the House had this security summit, and then they made 7 recommendations, part of which was that's to the president, one of which was that they should declassify security votes after 4 years. Would that be a good idea, in order to address some of the security challenges anyway?
I'll be very honest with you and tell you that I haven't gotten to do a closer analysis or take a closer look at that. But now you have my attention on that. So it's something I'd want to look at closely before I'm able to comment on that. However, if you do not mind, in just a quick moment, to address the question that Mark had asked the doctor, I think a major issue is that the open grazing bill has been seen as some kind of vendetta, some kind of thing to address the issue. However, if it was taken from a completely different angle, from a different point of view, like I said, I'll take the Southwest, for example. How many states do we have in the Southwest? And where 6,000 cattle heads are consumed here in Lagos State alone. Isn't this the kind of business that should really be, shouldn't it be looked at as a serious kind of business, which will ordinarily eliminate let open grazing just die a natural death?
All right, and I think there's some thinking in Lagos. We've seen, semblance of what you mentioned. But that's where we have to let this conversation go with both of you. Honorable Dio Bush Alebiosu, former member of the House of Reps, pioneer chair of the House's subcommittee on the EFCC. We've also had Dr. Austin Tam-George, communication and media consultant, as well as the former commissioner for information in Rivers State. Gentlemen, thank you both for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having us.